This video will provide a brief explanation of Julius Evola's tripartite view of race. Evola identifies three components of an individual's race: race of the body, race of the soul, and race of the spirit. This distinction is made in Revolt Against the Modern World, when Evola is discussing the factors of a civilization. For Evola, race and civilization are intrinsically linked. To consider race without civilization would seem utter nonsense to Evola. Therefore, as we define the three elements of race, it will be clear why the race of the body alone is insufficient for Evola. The race of the body is the material, biological, positivist conception of race based on blood. Evola writes that in traditional civilizations, blood is never used as a criteria of racial purity as it is in animals. Animals lack the higher spiritual elements of humans, having no civilization, and therefore no higher principle upon which to determine race. Humans do. Let us read from Revolt Against the Modern World directly, where Evola is discussing the factors of civilization, and he responds to the explanation of race as the primary element of civilization. Quote, "The idea that is sometimes upheld against the insufficiency of these explanations is that of race. The unity and the purity of blood are believed by some to be the foundation of life and the strength of a civilization. Therefore, the mixing and the ensuing poisoning of the blood are considered the initial cause of a civilization's decline. This, too, is an illusion, which, among other things, lowers the notion of civilization to a naturalistic and biological plane, since this is the plane on which race is thought of in our day and age. Race, blood, hereditary purity of blood, these are merely material factors. A civilization in the true, traditional sense of the word arises only when a supernatural and non-human force of a higher order, a force that corresponds to the pontifical function, to the component of the right, and to the principle of spirituality as the basis of a hierarchical differentiation of people, acts upon these factors. At the origin of every true civilization, there lies a divine event. Every great civilization has its own myth concerning divine founders. Thus, no human or naturalistic factor can fully account for it. The adulteration and decline of civilizations is caused by an event of the same order, though it acts in the opposite degenerative sense. When a race has lost contact with the only thing that has and can provide stability, namely the world of being, and when in a race that which forms its most subtle yet most essential element has been lost, namely the inner race and the race of the spirit, compared to which the race of the body and of the soul are only external manifestations and means of expression, then the collective organisms that a race has generated, no matter how great and powerful, are destined to descend into the world of contingency. They are at the mercy of what is irrational, becoming, and historical, and of what is shaped from below and from the outside. Blood and ethnic purity are factors that are valued in traditional civilizations too. Their value, however, never justifies the employment, in the case of human beings, of the same criteria employed to ascertain the presence of pure blood in a dog or in a horse, as is the case in some modern racist ideologies. The blood or racial factor plays a certain role not because it exists in the psyche, in the brain, and in the opinions of an individual, but in the deepest forces of life that various traditions experience and act upon as typical formative energies. The blood registers the effects of this action, yet it provides through heredity a material that is preformed and refined so that through several generations, realizations similar to the original ones may be prepared and developed in a natural and spontaneous way. It is on this foundation, and on this foundation only, that, as we shall see, the traditional world often practiced the heredity of the castes and willed endogamous laws. If we refer, however, to the Indo-Aryan tradition in which the caste system was the most rigorously applied, simply to be born in a caste, though necessary, was not considered enough. It was necessary for the quality virtually conferred upon a person at birth to be actualized by initiation. I have already mentioned that according to the Manudharma Sastra, unless a man undergoes initiation or second birth, even though he may be an Aryan, he is not superior to a Sudra. I also related how three special differentiations of the divine fire animated the three hierarchically higher Persian Pishtra, and that definite membership in one of them was sealed at the moment of initiation. Even in these instances, we should not lose sight of two factors being present, and never mistake the formative element for the element that is formed, nor the conditioning for the conditioned factor. Both the higher castes and traditional aristocracies, as well as superior civilizations and races, those that enjoy the same status that the consecrated castes enjoy vis-a-vis the plebeian castes of the children of the earth, cannot be explained by blood, but through the blood by something that goes beyond blood and that has a metabiological character. When this something is truly powerful, or when it constitutes the deeper and most stable nucleus of a traditional civilization, then that civilization can preserve and reaffirm itself, even when ethnical mixtures and alterations occur, no matter how destructive they may be, by reacting on the heterogeneous elements and shaping them, by reducing them slowly but gradually to their own type, or by regenerating itself into a new, vibrant unity. In historical times, there are a number of cases of this: China, Greece, Rome, Islam. Only when a civilization's generating root from above is no longer alive, and its spiritual race is worn out or broken, does its decline set in, and this in tandem with its secularization and humanization. When it comes to this point, the only forces that can be relied upon are those of the blood, which still carries atavistically within itself, through race and instinct, the echo and the trace of the departed higher element that has been lost. It is only in this way that the racist thesis in defense of the purity of blood can be validly upheld, if not to prevent, at least to delay the fatal outcome of the process of dissolution. It is impossible, however, to really prevent this outcome without an inner awakening." End quote. Evola sees that the genetics of a person are not the originating element of race. Rather, the genetics of a person are selected for by a civilization and provide the foundation upon which to build a person of a particular race. A person's blood is merely the result of that selection process, undergone in a civilization to produce a person of a certain type. A person of a certain racial type can only be created through particular initiating rites that stem from a higher realm, the effects of which are then reflected materially. He also notes in response to the nationalism of the blood that was particularly prevalent during his life, that blood alone is not sufficient to uphold a civilization. Essentially, Evola believes that biological race is important in the latter stages of decline, in which it represents the sole factor through which any elements of the civilization are preserved, but can never be enough on its own. The higher spiritual element of a civilization must be reawakened to ultimately prevent collapse. Evola is most concerned with what he calls the race of the spirit, as it is this element that represents the highest spiritual and religious aspects of a race. We can examine two further specific cases Evola mentions for further clarity. On the Aryan race, he writes, quote, "The traces of the northern and solar spirituality can be found in historical times, mainly in the area of the Aryan civilizations. Considering the abuse that has been made of the term Aryan in some contemporary milieus, such a term should be used with some reservations. In other words, it should not be made to correspond to a merely biological or ethnic concept. In this regard, it would be more appropriate to talk about a boreal or northern Atlantic race, depending on the case at hand, but rather to the concept of a race of the spirit, whose correspondence to a physical race has varied from one civilization to another. Aryan corresponds more or less to heroic. The connection with the origins still exists as a dimmed legacy, but the decisive element is the tendency toward inner liberation and the reintegration in an active and combative form. The fact that in India the term Arya was a synonym of Dvija, twice born or regenerated, supports this point." End quote. On the Jewish race, he writes, quote, "Not without relation to all this, in ancient Judaism we find a very visible effort on the part of a priestly elite to dominate and coalesce a turbid, multiple, and turbulent ethnical substance by establishing the divine law as the foundation of its form, and by making it the surrogate of what in other people was the unity of the common fatherland and the common origins. From this formative action, which was connected to a sacred and ritualistic values and preserved from the first redactions of the ancient Torah to the elaboration of the Talmuds, the Jewish type arose as that of a spiritual rather than a physical race." End quote. Between the race of body and the race of spirit lies the race of soul. Race of the soul corresponds to what might be called character, style, or attitude. Evola is adamant that the race of the body, race of the soul, and race of the spirit may diverge from one another. In another work from the 1940s, Synthesis of Racial Doctrine, he writes, quote, "The cases in which the race of the soul and the inner vocation do not correspond to the race of the body, such as those of every romantic laceration, in the final analysis are to be explained in such a way from the metaphysical point of view. Even modern psychology knows, at this point, about so-called split personalities, and the more the minor forces diverge from the central direction, the more we will have, as the effect, men in whom the physical is not in accord with the soul, in whom the spirit contrasts with the body and the soul, whose vocation does not correspond to race or caste, the personality is in disagreement with tradition, and so on." End quote. Getting deeper into this topic is far beyond the scope of this video, as to truly understand it, which is knowledge that I do not claim to have myself, requires an in-depth understanding of ancient metaphysics. However, if you still feel confused by the concepts of divergence in a person's physical, soulful, and spiritual race, this video clip should elucidate the meaning. Thanks for watching.
Don't play with that girl, because she is not one of them. Yeah, fuck you talking about. Missus put that shit on. Fuck you talking about. Period. Pussy that hoe can never.